There's a strip of land in Central America, barely 50 miles wide, that quietly decided who would rule the 20th century. Look at it on a map and it's nothing. A thin green thread stitching two continents together. But whoever controlled that thread controlled something no army could seize: the distance between two oceans. Before it was cut, a ship sailing from New York to San Francisco faced 13,000 miles of open sea, down the spine of South America and around the frozen teeth of Cape Horn, where whole crews left port and were never heard from again. A canal across Panama would shrink that nightmare to under 5,000 miles. Every empire on earth understood what that was worth. This is the story of how the United States came to own that prize. And it didn't come by it honestly. A secret treaty, a revolution written before it happened, a warship that stopped an army, a decision that pushed two nations to the edge of war. But the first men to try were French, and Panama destroyed them. Ferdinand de Lesseps was the most celebrated builder alive. He'd already cut the Suez Canal through the Egyptian desert, and the world crowned him the great engineer, though he wasn't an engineer at all. He was a salesman of dreams. In 1881, he turned to Panama and made a fatal assumption: that this would be another flat desert trench. It was the opposite. Panama was a wall of mountains buried in the densest rainforest on the planet, cut by a river that could rise dozens of feet in a single storm. Then the dying began. Men healthy at breakfast were shivering by dark, skin gone yellow, bleeding from the inside, vomiting a black fluid that was partly their own blood. Yellow fever. Beside it, malaria. And nobody, not one doctor on the isthmus, understood how either disease spread. Hold on to that mystery, because the answer was so simple it would take 20 more years and a different nation to see it. The hospitals became the deadliest places of all. Nurses stood the legs of the beds in dishes of water to stop the ants, and those dishes bred the very mosquitoes carrying the fever from patient to patient. By the end, the company's own records counted around 22,000 dead. The French had sunk roughly $287 million into the mud, the savings of some 800,000 ordinary families. In 1889, the whole thing collapsed into bankruptcy, and the wreckage cracked open a scandal of bribed officials and bought newspapers that shook France to its core. De Lesseps died disgraced in 1894. 50 miles of rusting machinery sank into the jungle. Any sane nation saw a warning. But one young French engineer who'd survived that fever looked at the ruin and saw an unfinished fortune, and he was about to hand an entire country to the United States. His name was Philippe Bunau-Varilla. Bunau-Varilla had one obsession: the canal would be finished, and America would finish it. There was only one problem. America didn't want Panama. Congress favored a different route entirely, through Nicaragua. Longer, but carrying no 22,000 ghosts, no bankrupt French company, no stain. In fact, Congress had passed a law, the Spooner Act, that committed America to Nicaragua unless the Panama rights could be bought quickly and cleanly. The greatest engineering project in history was one vote away from being built somewhere else. So Bunau-Varilla found a partner, William Nelson Cromwell, a sleek New York lawyer who worked the back rooms of Washington, like a man who always knew which hand to grease. A zealot and a fixer out to flip the government of the United States. Their motive wasn't love of country. Bunau-Varilla still held shares in the dead French company, paper worth nothing unless America chose Panama, and a fortune if it did. He was lobbying for his own pocket, and he was very good at it. Then nature handed him a weapon. In May 1902, the volcano Mont Pelée erupted on Martinique and wiped out a city of 30,000 people in minutes. The horror filled every newspaper in America, and Nicaragua, as it happened, printed postage stamps showing a smoking volcano named Momotombo. Bunau-Varilla saw his opening. He bought the stamps and mailed one to every member of the United States Senate, a small printed warning that Nicaragua's canal would sit on a bed of fire. Historians still debate how many minds that stamp truly changed. But within days the Senate reversed course and chose Panama by the narrowest of margins. That left the price. The French company wanted a king's ransom for its rusting equipment and rights. A US commission coldly valued the lot at $40 million. Facing the loss of everything, the company suddenly, gratefully, agreed to exactly $40 million. In one stroke, Cromwell and Bunau-Varilla had turned a graveyard into the biggest payday of their lives. They had the route, they had the sail, but one obstacle still stood in the way, and it wasn't jungle or mountain or disease, it was a nation. Panama wasn't a country at all, it was a province of Colombia. And to build, America needed Colombia's permission. Colombia was about to refuse. And what the president did about that refusal would bring two countries to the brink of war, and redraw the map of the Americas in 3 short days. In 1903, the United States offered Colombia a deal, $10 million plus yearly rent for the right to dig across Panama. It was called the Hay-Herran Treaty, and the American Senate ratified it. Then the Colombian Senate did something Washington never expected. It rejected the treaty unanimously, holding out for more money, and for the one thing it would not surrender: its sovereignty. Theodore Roosevelt was incandescent. He privately dismissed Colombia's leaders as contemptible little creatures who were blackmailing him. He had already decided the canal would be built in Panama and nowhere else. A sovereign nation telling him no wasn't a negotiation. It was an obstacle to be removed. And so a quieter, darker plan began to move. Bunau-Varilla met privately with Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay. Nothing was ever put on paper. But the Frenchman walked out certain of one thing: if Panama rose up against Colombia, American warships would be there. Then he did something almost beyond belief. From a hotel room in New York City, Bunau-Varilla personally drafted Panama's Declaration of Independence. He wrote its constitution. He had a flag designed, all for a country that did not yet exist and a revolution that had not yet happened. He gave the conspirators a precise date by which an American warship would appear. If he was wrong, every one of them would hang for treason. Their lives rode on the word of a man 1,000 miles away. On November 2nd, 1903, the USS Nashville steamed into the harbor at Colon, exactly on schedule. Colombia rushed its own soldiers to the isthmus, the Tiradores battalion, to crush the revolt before it could breathe. And here the trap closed. Railwaymen loyal to the plot greeted the Colombian generals warmly, sat them on a train to Panama City to meet the authorities, then separated them from their troops and arrested them. Their soldiers were stranded on the far coast, leaderless, hemmed in by American guns and American control of the only railroad across the isthmus. The revolution spilled almost no blood. In 3 days, it was finished. 3 days after that, on November 6th, the United States officially recognized the Republic of Panama, a nation less than a week old, born in a hotel room and delivered by a battleship. Panama was free. It would stay truly its own for about 2 weeks, because its first treaty, the document that would define it for a century, had already been written. And it was about to be signed by a man who had never been Panamanian in his life. Here is where the word secret in this story earns its place. As his reward for engineering the revolution, the grateful new government of Panama named Bunau-Varilla its first ambassador to the United States. Sit with that. A Frenchman who had never lived in Panama, who had appointed himself the midwife of its independence, was now legally empowered to bargain away Panamanian land, the very land his personal fortune depended on selling. And he knew the clock was against him. A real delegation of Panamanians, led by Manuel Amador, was already racing from New York toward Washington to negotiate the treaty themselves. If they reached the capital first, they'd demand better terms for their new country. So Bunau-Varilla decided to sign before they could arrive. On November 18, 1903, he and Secretary of State John Hay put their names to the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty. The terms are the kind you read twice. The United States was granted a zone slicing across the middle of a 2-week-old nation to hold and control in perpetuity, forever, governing it as if it were American soil. They were terms even more sweeping than the deal Colombia had just rejected in outrage. Then comes the detail that says everything. Amador and the Panamanian delegation reached Washington 2 hours after the ink was dry. 2 hours. It was already done. They were handed a finished treaty and shown the shape of the cage. Rejected, and the United States would withdraw the protection keeping them alive. And Colombia would return, and the leaders of the revolt would hang. So they signed, some of them in tears. The Republic of Panama began its life already owned, its single most valuable possession, signed away by a man who was not one of its citizens, handed to the country that had just willed it into being. As ruthless statecraft, it was nearly flawless. As the foundation of a nation, it was a wound, one that would fester through Panamanian politics for the rest of the century. Now only one thing stood between the United States and the greatest strategic prize on the planet. America had to actually build the canal, and to do that, it had to beat the invisible killer that had already buried 22,000 men. Remember the mystery from the very beginning. The fever no one could explain, the killer that broke the French. An American army doctor named William Gorgas believed he finally understood it, and his theory sounded like madness at the time. The disease wasn't carried by foul air or filth. It was carried by the mosquito. So Gorgas declared war on an insect. His men drained every pool of standing water, fumigated whole towns in clouds of smoke, and screened the windows of the isthmus. Slowly, the fever that had beaten de Lesseps began to lift. That, more than any machine, was the reason America could do what France could not. Then came the engineering answer. The United States threw out de Lesseps's deadly sea-level fantasy and built something far cleverer. A staircase of locks that lifted ships up and over the mountains, floated them across a vast artificial lake, then lowered them to the far ocean. Under the relentless drive of George Goethals, thousands of workers tore the Culebra Cut straight through the continental divide, moving some 240 million cubic yards of rock and earth. the largest excavation humankind had ever attempted. On August 15, 1914, a steamship called the Ancon made the first official transit from ocean to ocean, and in a twist of timing history almost forgot, the canal opened in the very weeks the First World War erupted across Europe. The world was looking elsewhere, but the United States now held its hand on a switch joining the Atlantic to the Pacific, a navy that could race between two oceans in days, a shortcut for the trade of the entire planet. This narrow, blood-soaked, stolen strip of land had just made America a superpower. But the reckoning was still coming. In 1911, Theodore Roosevelt stood before a crowd at Berkeley and said the quiet truth out loud. "I took the isthmus, not defended, boasted. Colombia never forgot the theft." In 1921, 2 years after Roosevelt was in his grave, the United States quietly paid Colombia $25 million, an apology it could never bring itself to speak in plain words. And the wound in Panama never fully closed either. It would take until 1977 and a treaty signed by Jimmy Carter before America even agreed to give the canal back, and 1999 before it finally did. So the next time you see those enormous ships climbing the locks of Panama, stair-stepping between the oceans, remember what they're really passing over: a graveyard of 22,000 souls, a revolution written in a hotel room, a treaty signed 2 hours too early by a man from another country. America got the canal that built its century, the single 50-mile secret that turned a young republic into a global power. The only question left is the one it never wanted to answer. What did it cost? And who really paid for it?